previously working on product teams at Havenly in Denver and Ibotta in Denver as well. Guild education, a little bit about our company. So we offer education as a benefit. So similar to when you join a company and you have maybe 401k benefits or health benefits, what we offer is free education to employees for the employer partners that we partner with, and absolutely love working there.
Thanks, Christine. And last but not least, Paul.
What's up, everyone? I'm Paul. I'm an engineering manager at Skookum. I've been at Skookum for about 2 years. Before that, I was a director of design over at another Denver company called Crown Peak. So I've seen a lot of angles of product development. A little bit about Skookum. Skookum is a software consulting firm specializing in digital strategy, software design, and software engineering. We're here in Denver with about 20 people, about 150 people in our company total. And we generally work with pretty big enterprise clients. So lots of big projects.
All right. Thanks, Paul. So just a few kind of logistical things before we get started here. I think Chris just posted in the chat, but feel free to use the Q&A section as we go through, and we'll try to have some time at the end for questions. And also, we're halfway through the week here, so I know you all have been sitting in a lot of Zoom sessions. So we'll try to keep things engaging with a couple polls as we go through the panel. And to kick things off here, I'm going to launch a poll right now, just asking what your current role is to help us get a sense of our audience and who's participating today. So if you want to go ahead and answer that, we'll see who we have here today. And while those results come in, just a quick rundown of how we're going to structure the panel. As indicated kind of in the session description, we're going to have 3 areas of focus today. So the first few questions are going to look at knowing your stakeholders and how they communicate with you. Next, we're going to move into how you can use the data that you receive, whether that's from stakeholders, from analytics and tracking, or your own research for effective prioritization, road mapping, and scoping. And then the third section, we're going to talk about helping customers as well as internal teams understand your process and how you can help them buy into the company roadmap, or at least how we all do that at our organizations. So I'm going to go ahead and end the poll here, and hopefully, let's see, I'll share the results so that you can see all those. It looks like we have a lot of product managers and owners here, which is awesome. That's obviously a large part of what we're going to be talking about is the product management process, but we also have we have Paul, who has an engineering background here, and I see a lot of folks on the marketing side as well as some other folks here too. So thank you all for contributing that info. I'm going to stop the poll and we can hop into things here. So like I said, the first section that we're going to talk about today is knowing your stakeholders and how they communicate with you. So I wanted to start by, chatting with a couple of the panelists here about, who are your stakeholders and how do you engage with them? Thinking about, how much information you solicit from stakeholders and how that factors into your process. And we'll start off with Chris.
Sure. Thanks, Nate. One thing I love about the product management discipline is that we get to work with so many different people. So the list of stakeholders is actually really, really long. I like to organize it kind of in my head, but on a spectrum of how close they are to the customers. So starting off, of course, we have our customers, and it's super important that product managers are talking to customers on a very regular basis. I actually create a plan at the beginning of every quarter of, what type of questions I want answered and what customers I should reach out to answer those questions. So, if I'm considering moving into a new space and I know these customers operate in that space, I'm going to try to do a poll of, let's say, 10 randomly selected customers, try to make it pretty wide ranging in terms of size and type of customer. And I'm going to schedule those meetings right away because that's super important for the product manager. So starting first with customers and then moving to your customer success teams and your sales teams, which often have strong relationships with your existing customers and potential customers. For those two things, I think about both inbound and outbound communication. So when I'm talking about inbound communication, I think it's really important that product managers have a very open line where anytime a customer success gets off a call and they have an idea, they should be able to send it to you right away. So whether that's via Slack, which is what my company uses, ideas, or maybe even a Google form where, you know, they have the link on their desktop and it's super easy to get to, and they just throw ideas there, or if it's just email. But you want to make sure that you are very friendly and they feel like they can always reach out to you about anything, because that's where really innovative ideas pop up. It's the person that you didn't expect to have it, and they feel comfortable enough to share it with you. So having that really open communication. And then next, going down the spectrum, we'd be looking at our executive team, or maybe our strategy team that's really laying out where the company is going to go next. And then you've got your product marketing team, and then your engineers and designers. And so for all of those ones kind of a little further away from the customer, I'm looking at my outbound communication. So I have a very periodic and regular communication cycle, both by email and by video, because I found that some people ignore my emails, other people love my emails. So I try to mix it up now and then, and I'll do a quick 5-minute video and be like, hey guys, and as long as you keep it quick and short and lighthearted, people will actually watch it. And so in those videos, I try to give them updates on anything that's recently been released, and then updates on my roadmap, and also give them an idea of what I'm researching. Because part of being a product manager is thinking 6 months in advance and saying, okay, there's this really interesting idea. What type of research am I doing with my customers to see if this is an area we want to move in? And by sharing that with all of your internal stakeholders, you can start picking up ideas from them. Like, they'll be inspired by your idea and they'll come back to you with good ideas too. So it's very important that you have both that inbound and outbound communication, and make sure it's very open, honest, and transparent.
Yeah, I think that's awesome. I know at FareHarbor, we rely entirely on internal stakeholders to communicate on behalf of our clients. So, you know, I'll probably mention this a few times throughout the panel today, but we have a single internal form that all of our internal stakeholders use to communicate with us. So that's, you know, our CX and sales team, as well as our executive team, marketing, engineers, anyone has access to that. And that allows them to communicate their needs to us, and creates a central repository for all that information, which helps to coordinate exactly what you were talking about, Chris, just the communication pieces of it, which are so important. Christine, Paul, anything to add to that about either Guild or Skookum stakeholders and how you guys engage with them?
I think the only thing that I would add is, at previous companies, rather than just having like a Google form or a way for people to submit, we really encouraged a dialogue as well. So at Ibotta, they probably still have this. If anyone from Ibotta is on the call, they can keep me honest on this. But when I worked there, it was kind of like a community similar to Reddit, where anyone could post an idea, and people could upvote it, and product managers were tasked with kind of monitoring that to be able to respond to, you know, ideas and be able to facilitate the discussion. And so I really liked that as well. We're actually planning on standing that up at Guild. I think it can become a little bit untenable if the discussion is really lively, but I think the benefits far outweigh the costs there. So that's another way to kind of facilitate stakeholder feedback and input kind of throughout the process.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that transparency and creating that open dialogue is definitely really an important piece of it. Next question that I had for the panel here was, how do you weigh the value of input from external stakeholders against directives from leadership, or for those that know the term, HIPPOs, so the highest paid person's opinion can sometimes weigh pretty heavily in the product decision-making process. So curious to hear how, you know, you weigh those opinions or those perspectives against what you're hearing from some external stakeholders. And Paul, we haven't heard from you yet, so we'll let you kick it off.
Sure. So picking your battles can be really hard, especially when you're dealing with powerful stakeholders. And as an engineering manager, most engineers are kind of framed as kind of pessimistic because we're always saying no. But the way that I frame this myself is turning the question back to the stakeholder and asking, like, for example, if they're asking for a new feature, I like to focus on MVPs. So I ask them, is what you're asking really going to contribute to the core of our product, the whole reason why our users signed up in the first place? And then if not, is it valuable enough to be a standalone effort where we stand up a team that's going to handle this, or we divert our resources to be able to address it? If so, then we go ahead and take it on. If not, we figure out our priority, we refigured out our priorities and figure out when we're going to address it. But ultimately, everything comes back to priority and focus.
Yeah, definitely. That I think we'll hear Paul talk a lot about MVP today, and I think that's so important of maintaining that focus on MVP and flexibility around it, but also having some level of I guess commitment to that MVP once you define it.
Yep.
Chris, curious to hear your thoughts on this one as well. How you weigh the value of external stakeholders' input against leadership.
I mean, hopefully your product manager, Paul, has done this work before you even look at it. Because ideally, the product manager's job is to prioritize the projects. And before it even gets on the engineering manager's desk, we should have already decided that this is the worthwhile thing to do. So how do you decide what's worthwhile and what's not? So, I mean, we always have these hippos in the room, and I've worked at small startups where the hippo is super strong and super powerful. But what I love is that data can usually shut them up if that's what you need. And so finding ways to get the data to support what you're pushing for is the key to making sure that you have the right items on your roadmap. So one of the standard frameworks that we've all probably heard before is called RICE, where you do kind of a mathematical equation using reach, impact, confidence, and effort. So kind of comparing all those four things, putting an estimate on each one of them. And that if you do that for your entire, let's say, backlog of all the great ideas that you've come up for your product, and just kind of do that really quickly with your best knowledge. As a product manager, we have access to a lot of data, so you can kind of ballpark it. That can help you figure out what should be at the top of the roadmap. And then once you have that, once you have the top 4 or 5, then you should start digging in a little bit deeper. And that goes back to some of the research I was mentioning before, where you're really digging in deep and seeing, okay, here are my, let's look at all of our customers. These are the customers that I've actually interviewed, and they said that they would love this, and this is how they would use it, which is great. So that's kind of guaranteed revenue potentially, or at least guaranteed usage. And then start looking also at the wider market as well to get a sense of, could we bring in additional revenue through this, and who would be those types of people? And so kind of looking at all those deals, putting numbers behind every idea is really important. And then that can help you go to your hippo and really explain that this is the best idea because it's going to bring in the best revenue or the best usage.
So that's a really nice segue into the next kind of section. So I'm going to skip ahead here because I have a follow-up to that, Chris. You're talking a lot about data, and the second part of our panel here, we wanted to talk about using data for prioritization, road mapping, and scoping. So could you go a little bit more into detail on that? What data do you use to prioritize your roadmap and kind of, if necessary, counter a hippo's opinion or maybe come into agreement with that data?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's tough because you do need to straddle between strategy and pure numbers, because at times you might have a strategy as a company to move into a new space, and because it's brand new, you're not going to have the usage data at all because it doesn't exist. And so you do kind of have to juggle those two. And I know what I've done in the past is I kind of, we've come to an agreement as in for the next 2 quarters, we're going to be focusing on strategy. So we're going to go into a new space where we're really looking at more market type data. So looking at the market size, looking at some of our competitors, where they have moved, getting a sense of how big their customers are and what type of revenue that they generate. Also talking to our existing customers that might be able to expand into this new space, and using a lot of assumptions really to put together some sort of pure market size. And so I'm actually talking about numbers. So we will actually say, we estimate that, in the first 1 year to 2 years, if we move into this new market space, our revenue potential could be this, which might be 2 million, 20 million or something like that. So there's that side of strategy. But if you're working at building up new features of your existing product where you already have usage, that's where you can gather, make sure you're doing your segment tracking and capturing events of your customer users, and get a sense of the funnel activities that they're doing. And you can actually say, okay, we're actually losing people in this spot in the funnel because maybe we're missing a core feature or it's poorly designed. So let's dig in there because that could open up this third step in the funnel. Also getting a sense of, you might have, if you think of the product tree where you have your core product and you have these helpful things that are off of that product, you might look at one of those parts of the tree and see that it's not being used. And so then you should start doing some interviews trying to understand why it's not being used. It might not be used because it's poorly designed, or it might not be used because it's just not that good of a, it's just not that necessary. The need isn't there. So in that case, you might want to abandon the product altogether. So I look at data as kind of your starting point, where it's like a guiding light of where you might want to look. It's like a flashlight. But then once you have your flashlight focused on something, you have to dig in and start talking to customers to really understand what the next step should be.
Totally. I think that's great. That's great insight. And I know that FareHarbor drives a lot of our, our information that we use to inform our product decisions from those conversations with those external stakeholders, with our customers. And kind of along those lines, yesterday I was participating in a product webinar with a different conference. As Chris says, it's conference season. There's a lot of this going on. And Greg Batchelor from AB Tasty mentioned a quote from Henry Ford, which I'm sure many of you have heard before. Sometime after he invented the Model T, he said, if I had asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. And so kind of to segue from that point, Chris, of the importance of these customer conversations, I think those are a huge benefit, but they can also be a challenge because stakeholders frequently propose solutions instead of explaining the problem they're trying to solve. So the next question that I had for the panel was, how do you solicit the most useful information from stakeholders, and specifically those your clients or sometimes internal stakeholders who are more likely to think about solutions instead of problems. And Christine, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this one.
I really like this question because it comes up very, very often. I think it's really natural to speak in solutions. And I catch myself doing it even as a product manager. And so I think what you can do, whether you're talking to a CEO who is telling you we need this feature and actually we needed it yesterday, and so like your team needs to get going on this, or just like an idea that anyone has, is really like bringing it back to what problem you're solving or what opportunity you're going after. I think if you can have them repeat back to you what problem this aims to solve, the nice thing about that is they'll actually start to uncover flaws in their own solutioning a lot of times. So you don't have to have that awkward conversation of like, here's why this won't work, and kind of back it from there. And so I think that's always a good approach, is just asking them like, what problem does this aim to solve, or what opportunity are we going after? And then from there, once they've repeated that back to you, another thing that I like to do is, are you set on this solution? Or are you open to other solutions? And I don't always offer that up, but if it's the CEO that you're talking to or somebody like very high up, you want to see if they're open to other solutions or if they're not, because that will make the conversation much more productive. If they're just anchoring on this one solution, it might be kind of tough to walk them back from that. And so I always like to ask that question and then set up a follow-up. Let me take this back to the team and have them come back with, some solutions and risk level of each and effort of each. And then we can kind of vet those against the problem you're trying to solve to figure out what's the best solution for either an MVP, so minimum viable product, or long-term, if this is going to be a long-term thing that we're going after.
Awesome. Yeah, I really like that idea of asking the question, what is the problem? What problem is this trying to solve? FareHarbor has taken a pretty similar, a similar approach, but in that form where we collect all of the input from our internal stakeholders, we ask for a user story. So it's kind of a similar approach of allowing teams who are largely unfamiliar with traditional product lingo to communicate in a way that's more closely aligned with our team's problem-oriented approach. So just the way that you ask those questions, I think, is really important. So we can kind of transition now, I think, into the second part of our talk, using data for prioritization, road mapping, scoping, which Chris already talked a little bit about. Before we do that, I want to make sure that everybody is still with us here and paying attention. So we're going to have another poll here, which I will launch. And the question is basically, what is the primary challenge your organization faces when it comes to stakeholder engagement? So if you guys can take a look at this question and some of the multiple choice options that we provided here: time, process, communication, both inbound and outbound. Those are two different things that Chris was talking about earlier: prioritization, data, or conflict, just stakeholder groups having conflicting priorities. So I see some responses coming in here. I'll wait for that. I'll wait for other folks to submit what they have to say. And it looks like we have a pretty good distribution here. So I'm going to go ahead and end the poll and share results with you all here. So it looks like, the top thing that we're seeing here is conflict, stakeholder groups with conflicting priorities. So we can kind of talk to that as we move through this. Second here is time, just product or engineering team bandwidth. And it looks like third after that, inbound communication. So the way that stakeholders communicate with you. So that's really helpful information for us to have as we go through this. So as we kind of transition into that second part, I'm curious to hear, what's your process for scoping features and defining MVP, and how does stakeholder input contribute to that process? As we look again at kind of the criteria for prioritization and understanding what are the critical aspects of a minimum viable product or MVP. And like I said, this is Paul's wheelhouse, so we'll start with him on this one.
Yep. So everything from an engineering perspective is simplifying things. At Skookum, we have a value that is simplify and go. It's basically what is the way that we can focus our efforts and take the straightest path forward. Whenever I'm working on a product, no matter how big or small, things start getting a little weird when you lose focus of what your core functionality of your product is. You start slapping on other features and start making everything much more complex. So bringing things back to what's the absolute core of your product? Why are your users really here and why did they show up? And then making that experience absolutely seamless. Once that is good, once that experience is seamless, then your users are going to be happy no matter what. And if there's any features that are starting to distract or pull away from that seamless experience that are somewhere in your product roadmap, maybe reconsider them. Think about how you can repackage it. Because the more that you make things complex, the harder decisions are going to be to make on the fly, the harder it's going to be to direct your teams. And ultimately, focusing on that core experience slims down the amount of work, the amount of complexity, and then focuses your entire delivery team so that everybody's taking a unified step forward.
Hey, Paul, we actually have a follow-up question for you before we go on to the next thing with Nate. Sure. So Greg asked, is there a general timeline that you use when you're planning on pushing out an MVP? As in, like, your ideal MVP, how long would it take you to make it?
Sure. So depends on the product, right? I think that what you want to do is the first piece, if you're building something from scratch, is build something testable. Build something that actually does deliver that core experience for your users so that they can play with it. See if it's actually useful to them. See if they're going to share it with their other similar users. And then remember that experience right there, that first delivery that you had. Whatever you're building on top of, make sure that first delivery doesn't get screwed up. If it starts to slow down, performance starts dragging, or it's buggy, you're starting to stray away and you're getting distracted. So as far as timeline goes, timeline's not so important as it is focusing on delivering the core product. It can take you as long as you want, but if you don't get that first core product right, it's all in vain.
Absolutely. It's all about that core value. Go ahead, Nate.
So, and then, well, I think kind of to continue on that topic, timelines maybe aren't as important, but understanding what your MVP is really important. And I think we do our best as product managers to understand MVP from the outset, but sometimes we're faced with new information that comes in. It's just going to be inevitable. So, you know, with that idea of a well-defined MVP and also the acknowledgement that MVP can change, I guess the follow-up that I have is, how do you respond to new information once you've already defined that MVP? And that can go to really anyone. Paul, if you have info on that, or Christine or Chris, really anyone.
Sure, I can jump on that. I'm actually going to steal from a presentation that I saw earlier this week, which was like from a website design agency, why you don't need a new website. And he made a point in there where it was, your data is valuable. Your data is extremely valuable, but you need to make sure that you're framing it in the right way. So a great example of this is like the settings page in Slack. I probably don't visit that very often at all. And from a data perspective, that is one of the least used portions of that application. Does it mean it's not valuable? Absolutely not. So making sure that you're framing your data the right way is very important, first of all. And then second, like, make sure you're actioning on that in the right way. So if it turns out that users aren't using a certain piece of your application, try to figure out the deeper reason why, and then solve for that, if you think that that's critical to your product.
That makes a lot of sense. Anything else to add from Christine or Chris? Okay. So that's helpful. I think that's all really helpful information about the data prioritization process, and kind of defining an MVP and using that inbound information to respond from a product perspective. Let's see here. I'm just catching up on my notes. So I see some things coming into chat and the Q&A, so thank you all for doing that. Chris is responding to those things. And I think it probably makes sense to transition into kind of the third part of our panel here, so that we have time at the end to respond to some of those questions. So the third part that we wanted to talk about was getting stakeholders to buy into your process. And I think this is really important, especially given the results of that second poll. I saw a lot of folks responding with conflict being the primary, I guess, sticking point for your product process. So, you know, how can we get past that conflict? How can we make sure that all stakeholders feel like they're being heard, but also that you're sticking with your roadmap and you have validated that roadmap with data and with information that you can respond to. So I think Chris talked a lot about communication. I think that's a really instrumental part to this. So the next question that we had was, how do you communicate your roadmap to stakeholders? Level of detail have you found to be effective in those external communications of your roadmap? And I guess I'd like to hear from Christine first.
Yeah, so I think before I dive into what exactly we do to communicate our roadmaps, what I'll emphasize first is that getting buy-in into what that process looks like from leadership is crucially important. Making sure that you kind of gut check, like, is this the right level of information you're looking for? Would this like be useful to you before you roll out a big process to the team? I think I would highly recommend. And then I'll share what works for us, but it may be that you need to go back to your stakeholders and see like what level of information works for you, what is most useful for you. So for us, what we've found, which I really love and wish we would have used at previous companies, is kind of a now, next, later roadmap. And so what's nice about that is you're not committing to dates. If you're doing agile development, this is a really nice way to kind of marry the two, because you're not committing to dates. How we kind of structure that is, now is the current quarter. So next 90 days, what are we looking to accomplish? Next is kind of 1 to 2 quarters out after that, what are we looking to do? And then later is long term, maybe this is in a year plus, this is kind of our vision of where we would like to get to. I think what's nice about that is it's pretty brief. It doesn't go into a ton of excruciating detail, and it kind of tells a story of like, this is what we need to solve for today, but ultimately this is where we would like to go. And it opens up a lot of good dialogue about, is that the vision that you should be having? Do your stakeholders align with that vision, or can we course correct now? What we do in addition to that is for the now bucket, we then have a supporting document that goes into each OKR. So we do the OKR process, which is objectives and key results. And so for each of those, we have the detail of what we're doing, why we're doing it, and what the goal is for that current quarter. And so you think about next is going to have a little bit less detail, and later is going to have even less detail. So you're really focusing on filling in the detail for what you're working in now, so people are very crisp on what's in and what's out for what you're building.
So to follow up on that, Christine, when you're getting information kind of consistently, you talked about that process of collecting information, but then also creating a dialogue behind the information that you receive back. If something is on the later end of the spectrum and you're receiving information for it now, how do you handle that? How do you make sure that someone's voice is heard, even though it won't be acted upon for the next potentially like year?
Yeah, it's a very good question, because I think people get nervous if they don't see things on the now bucket. Like, are you just ignoring this? Are you not thinking about this? Do you not care about this? And it's, well, of course we care about this, but it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And so that's the kind of discussion I try to have is, I'm not saying we shouldn't do this. I'm just wondering if you think like this is worth doing now versus like if we do some of these other things, are we better positioned to do this next quarter or the following quarter? And I think just having an open dialogue about that. The other thing that we do that I didn't mention before is we have a we will not do list, or we're not working on this now. And it's very important to say like, this is what this feature is, and this is what it isn't. And it doesn't mean that it's not going to be that later, but it's not going to be that this quarter, because we have to walk before we can run. And so I think that is really important too, because I'm sure anyone who works in product knows, like, you come up with a title for this broad initiative, and they assume every single little feature that could be under this broad initiative is going to be built this quarter. And that's just not reality. So I think that's really important too.
Totally agreed on that. And I think one of the first questions that came in to the Q&A was from Kate White, and she said, what tools do you use to consolidate, gather, organize stakeholder feedback? And I think that's an important piece of this conversation too. At FareHarbor, we use Product Board, which allows us we basically collect information through a form that's built in Airtable that feeds via Zapier, which is an integration service that allows all of that feedback from our Airtable form to flow into Product Board. And to answer your question, Kate, like that is the central repository where we have all of that feedback from our internal stakeholders coming in. It's also a great tool for external stakeholders or your customers, which you had mentioned in your question, to submit their feedback as well. And in terms of that communication piece and keeping a dialogue, what that allows me as a product manager to do is see everything that comes into that central repository, respond to it, and also append that insight to a given feature in our backlog, because the backlog lives within Product Board. So we take that feedback, we append it to the feature, and regardless of where it is on our roadmap, now, next, or later, or in that, we will not do bucket that Christine was talking about, that allows us to have all of that information in one place and respond to it effectively. So Product Board is one of the tools that we use. I know that, when the four of us, the panelists here, were meeting a couple of weeks ago to talk about this, that was part of the tooling conversation. So I'm curious now to hear kind of some of the other tools that you guys are using to collect information from stakeholders and organize it. And that's open-ended. Anyone can. Yeah, Chris, go ahead.
So one thing that's interesting is if you're in a small product team, a tool like Product Board is great, and I've used it in the past. I also use Airtable, which has a lot of overlap with Product Board. And what I really like about that tool is it allows you to publish it so that you've got a public-facing view of your roadmap that anyone can just save that link and then log in any time. But I faced difficulty coming to my current company at Optimizely, where we have about 10 product managers. So we're getting kind of to a larger product team, and everyone kind of has their own own tools that they like. And so unfortunately, when it comes to public facing roadmaps, something that's always available, we go back to Google Sheets and Google Slides, because that way I can use Airtable because I really like Airtable. Other people use Jira. Some people use Product Board. And then every Monday we have our team meeting. And before that meeting, we're supposed to make any updates to our public facing slides. What's nice about that though, is they are slides that the sales team can just pick up and take and present right away. And so, it's all ready for them to go. But yeah, that's one way that we do it. And keep in mind that one of our goals is to make sure that we can communicate to our customers what is coming down the line, but not overpromise, of course. And so doing it in the form of slides works really well.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris. Christine, Paul, do you guys have other tools that you use to collect some of that stakeholder feedback, whether from internal or external folks?
We live in Google Sheets, so I empathize with that, Chris. It's funny. I used Product Board at my last company, and I agree. Like, it was great. Havenly, when I worked there, we're a team of 40 people, full stop, across the company, and so it worked super well. And what I found is, I think we were on like our third round of like tooling. We use Airtable as well, but we always go back to like Google Slides and Google Sheets. The other thing that I'll say about gathering stakeholder feedback, I mentioned this earlier, but we are trying to stand up a community, an online community, because it is a piece that we're missing now that we're a company of a size of 700, is that it's super difficult to get stakeholder feedback all the time and get it in a consistent way, in a way that opens up a dialogue. So we're going to be piloting that. Unfortunately, I can't tell you how it's gone, but fingers crossed.
It's definitely a balance of collecting the right level of information from the right people. And you're bound to get a lot of extra stuff in there if you open it up to everyone. Paul, I saw you had unmuted there. Did you have something to add?
Yeah, I think that, I've tried a bunch of products in the past and always end up going back to Sheets and Forms and Slides. There's some incredible products out there that can do a lot of great things. Ultimately, the simplicity of being able to pull up a spreadsheet, slap it together, send it over to people in 30 seconds, that is the nicest thing about collecting feedback, because I need it now. So those are generally the tools that I end up using, because I have a different use case every time I need feedback.
I think that's a really great perspective, and it's helpful to hear the repetitive answer there of Google Sheets. And I think the other aspect of that hasn't really been addressed here is accessibility. Like, everyone at your organization is familiar with Google Sheets or the Microsoft Suite, whatever you end up using. So having it there instead of an Atlassian product like Confluence or Jira, which maybe not everyone at your organization has access to, or maybe not everyone is familiar with, keeping it in a really familiar tool like a Google Suite product or a Microsoft product makes a lot of sense. So I know at the beginning when we asked the question about our audience, we had a number of folks on the marketing side as well. And I think that's a really interesting place to kind of wrap up our conversation today, is just the end part of product development, the release phase, and where product management, product ownership kind of becomes customer facing, and you need to work with marketing teams, but then also internal teams to make sure that everyone on your support, your CX, account management, sales teams, they know what features or what products you're releasing. So when a new product or feature is ready to be released, for the panel here, how do you engage stakeholders, specifically those who have contributed in the delivery process? And how do you collect feedback after a feature or product has been released? And I'll let anyone take the stage on this one.
So I'll let you go, Chris. Go ahead.
Sure. So this goes back to whether or not you did use a good tool or not. Because one of the hardest things that we do is we receive all this great input, and then 5 months, 10 months later, we finally do the feature you asked for, and I have to try to remember who the heck asked for it. And so that's where it is really important to have either. So I actually do a carbon copy of every request in Jira, and I know it's duplicating my work, but then I always know who asked for it because it's got the little tag in there. And so I do always try to go back to that person if I can remember, and if I can remember who they asked on behalf of in terms of our B2B customers, I'll also go back to that customer, and usually it's like a big celebration. And I'm like, I have your feature, woohoo! So that's one thing. We do have a very streamlined product marketing process, which I think is really important for B2B products or SaaS products, where I always, once a feature is ready to go live, I always create a standard overview deck that goes to our non-technical salespeople. Then I do a detailed dive deck, which sometimes is a video as well, which is a demo of how to actually use it. And there I'll also try to answer any technical questions that might come up. So it's kind of like an FAQ. And then we do a blog post for the public. We do an email blast. And so we kind of do these core things to make sure everyone is aware of this product. And then I may also reach out individually to either customers that I know would be a good candidate for this product, or their customer success manager, and just say, this product come out, I think your customer is a great fit. Make sure they're aware, and I'd be happy to jump on a call. And so that's kind of the process for rolling out a big new feature and making sure everyone is aware of it.
Yep. And to piggyback on that, it doesn't even need to be a big feature. As a user, I want to know about developments in the product. So a 20% speed increase is exciting to me. Security improvements are exciting to me. You can frame all these things as stuff that users are going to be excited about. Just because it's boring, and technical doesn't mean that it's not exciting to some of your users. All improvements to your product are things that have the opportunity to be marketed. So if your product team and your engineering team and your marketing team are all aligned in what's going to get delivered, you can excite your users in a whole lot of ways that doesn't just need to be major feature enhancements.
Actually, that reminded me of something. We'll jump to you, Christine, in just a second. That we actually have a Slack channel for our developer users because they tend to like Slack. And then we have a newsletter for our marketer users. It's important that you have, and then we have a blog too. So you have outbound communication with the newsletter, inbound with the blog, and make sure you have lots of different options that will fit the type of users that you have in your platform. Go ahead, Christine.
The only thing I was going to add is our use cases is quite different. So if you think about Guild Education, our end user is a prospective student. And so they're a one-time user. They're through the product pretty quickly. And once they enroll in a program, they're not really coming back to Guild. They're really interacting with that university, passing all of their classes, hopefully, and working towards graduation. And so it is very, very rare that we ever announce a new product enhancement to our users, to our core end user. What we will do, though, is we make sure the sales team is pretty well aware. So that way, when we're trying to land or expand a employer partner, that they're aware of the enhanced product experience that their employees will experience should they either sign up with Guild, or maybe they're already signed up with Guild, but we've heard their feedback from their employees, and now we're rolling out this new feature. So it's a little bit different. And then we have a Slack channel internally that is a product announcements channel. And so in that Slack channel, no matter how big or how small the product release is, we always announce it to the company, because a very small release could actually be very meaningful to this small customer success team that really wanted this feature. And maybe it was a tiny enhancement and it doesn't mean much to the rest of the company, but it means the world to that team. And so we're always announcing like any releases that we have to the entire company within this channel within Slack, which I would highly recommend. It also, I think, helps with visibility around product, because I think some teams, because we're not building their feature, will be like, I have no idea what the product team is doing. I don't know why they haven't built my feature yet, or why the engineering team hasn't built this feature yet, like what's going on. And so I think if you have that visibility to the entire company of like, here is what we're doing and this is what we're shipping, that can help with that too. So an added benefit there.
Totally. That was the point I was going to make off of, Paul saying these infrastructure updates, the speed updates that maybe aren't important or influential to everyone at the company, but it shows that the product team is making progress on some initiatives that are important to the company as a whole, which they might not have insight into otherwise. Chris, yeah, go for it.
We also have a Slack channel like that. We do demarcate though between visible changes and invisible changes. So like what Paul referred to would be an invisible change, super important, but visible changes are important because customers will call and be like, my page is different, I don't know what's going on. And so it's really important that our technical support understands that. So, but we absolutely, I love the transparency, making sure everything we work on, we get credit for it. And we send congratulations. When someone finally sends out a visible changes email, that means you finish your job, you finish your product, that's our feature. That's really awesome.
Well, and that's another important part of this rollout strategy is timelines and making sure that people are looped in at the appropriate time. If you have a relatively firm release date for a feature or product, and that's going to help your sales team close a deal, then you should be communicating with them about that before the feature has actually been rolled out. But you need to be careful with those communications and make sure that you're not overselling or you're selling on a timeline that isn't realistic. So it has to be very intentional, but there is some communication that should usually happen, before something releases as well. So timelines are really important. Great. Well, we have a few minutes left here, and I want to make sure to have time to respond to some of the questions that you all have submitted here. So we'll kind of transition into that. And one was from Kevin Rule, who asked, how do you balance between existing customer requests and broader roadmap strategy? And I think that's a really good question. I know I have some insights on that, but anyone else from the panel want to respond to Kevin's question here?
I think I would go back to a point that Chris made early on in the panel around grounding everything in data. I think it's the ultimate neutralizer. So if you can speak in like the amount of impact that an upcoming feature aims to make, and their feedback is that we shouldn't work on it or we should focus our time elsewhere, I think that if you can ground everyone in the data and what's going to move the business forward, that's a good way to start the conversation.
Adding to that, I think this question really depends a lot on the maturity of your product and your company. So early on, usually you have to do existing customer requests because you might lose that customer, and if you lose that customer, your company is gone. So I've worked in a very small Series B startup before, and we spent probably 70% of our time on existing customer requests. Part of what we did though was try to choose a specific customer to align ourselves with that we felt like was representative of the wider market, so that we're not just going to be wasting that time, but it's going to be building something that's helpful for everybody. But we had to do it, or else we could lose that customer, and that might bring down not let us get to Series C. But now I'm in Optimizely, we're Series D. We now focus on a broader roadmap strategy, and we really don't even, it doesn't matter if you're our biggest customer, you pay us $1 million a year, we're not listening to you. We are very focused on the wider market, how can we gain market share, and we need to deliver on that strategy.
Yes. I don't know if you saw me cheering over here, but you can get lost in trying to please everybody. If you focus on your niche, on a specific type of customer, you might think that that's limiting your user base, and like technically it is, but there's thousands of that person. And this could be a very special product for them. You could be the ultimate product for that person. So if you like, the more you focus on like who you're delivering for and why you're delivering for them, it's going to help you strategize all of this.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. We'll take one more question here before wrapping things up. Someone had asked, what are recommendations you can share for a small company expanding the product management team? That's something that FareHarbor has focused a lot on over the past 2 years. We were acquired by Booking Holdings in April of 2018, which obviously gave us a lot of resources to build out our team. And so a big part of my role over the past 2 years has been implementing scalable systems. And I think a lot of that revolves around communication. And I think we sound like broken records here with the communication piece, but it's just so important that if you're a small team right now, you implement systems that are systems for communication across your organization that are scalable, so that that takes into consideration how your stakeholders are contributing input to your process. For us, like I said, a form that's only accessible by internal stakeholders, because that's a filter that allows us to not hear from all 13,000 of our clients, which could maybe give us a lot of good information, but also some misinformation. So, for us, scalability has meant relying heavily on internal stakeholders to submit on behalf of our clients. And scalability has also looked like implementing tools like Product Board. And I know we've heard kind of varying opinions there. I keep speaking to Product Board because that's a tool that we're using, but I think the philosophy there is just to have a central repository for all that information, which makes it easy for you to have that visibility into all the insights coming in to one place. So that is the process that I've followed, building or helping to scale and grow the product team at FareHarbor. Anyone else have responses to that question about, a small company expanding the product team?
As a consulting firm, we help our clients build out their product teams pretty often. And then something that we do and help them do is workshop with them, whether that's on their product or how their organization is going to grow. And I think as you're scaling, workshop yourself. Why are you hiring these people? What's their focus? How can you strategize to make them the most effective? Do all that way before you get to the hiring phase. And once you understand that, it might be able to reframe how you're currently organizing your priorities. And if you indeed end up hiring somebody, how you're going to most effectively place them to be the most optimal team member for you.
Awesome. Thanks, Paul. So I think I'm going to wrap things up there because we have about 3 minutes left. And I did want to kind of pose one final question to our panelists, just to kind of encapsulate everything that we've talked about here today. So if you can distill it down into a single piece of advice or a single sentence, what advice would you give to product managers looking to improve the way that they engage with stakeholders, just like in a single sentence? And we'll hear from each of the panelists, and then we'll let you all go.
I'll go first. I think it's super important to be open and transparent and friendly so that people come to you with their ideas.
Thanks.
My advice would be to never have a ta-da moment. If you're ever like, ta-da, we built this to your stakeholders, you have failed. You should be keeping your stakeholders along the way. They should know what you're building. They should have input into what you're building, particularly if they're key stakeholders. So try to avoid those ta-da moments as best you can, and you'll be very successful.
Okay, I've got 3. One is keep on refocusing yourself, no matter how mature your company is. Refocus yourself on the core functionality and MVP of your product. The second one is keep all of your efforts super simple and communicate those things simply and focused. And then the third one, we didn't really get into timelines too much, but I'm just going to tell everybody, overestimate your timelines by like 2 or 3 times, because that's going to be the accurate number, not your optimistic view. Things are going to go wrong. So always build in a whole lot more time than you think you're going to need.
PMs hate this, but it's fine.
Sorry.
Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for joining today. And thank you, Chris, Paul, and Christine for contributing on all those insights. It's been really exciting to have this conversation. Feel free to reach out to any of us on LinkedIn. I know we're excited to be part of the ongoing product management conversation, and the tools and systems that we use at our organizations may be helpful to you, but I know we all love hearing different processes that are used elsewhere. So let's keep the conversation going. Thanks again to everyone for joining and to the panelists, and enjoy the rest of Denver Startup Week. Thanks all.
Thanks everyone. Thanks, Nate.